Hi everyone, welcome to this Bookmarks Bookshop book launch of Alexandra Kollontai, Writings from the Struggle. My name's Isabel Ringrose and I'll be hosting tonight's event. And we're really lucky to have with us the book's author, Cathy Porter. Cathy's translated and edited some of Kollontai's work for the first time in English, now available in the book, which you can get in Bookmarks. Unfortunately, Emma Davis, who is the author of A Rebel's Guide to Alexandra Kollontai, isn't able to be with us this evening. But you can still get Emma's book in Bookmarks too. So the way the meeting's going to work is Cathy's going to speak to us about the book and about Colontai, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and contributions, sort of a virtual discussion, if you like, to discuss Colontai, discuss the book, and discuss the amazing work that she did. So I really recommend people get their questions in early, get their contributions in early. No contributions too small. You can put your contributions in the video box underneath the video. So yeah, we'll get started. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Cathy. And yeah, over to you, Cathy.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for your kind words about the book. And thank you, everybody, weirdly, distantly, and collectively, for being here to discuss Kollontai's life and writing and why she matters to us now. Last week's rallies against the police crime bill were terrific, and the start, I'm sure, of many more to come in the next months as we leave lockdown. I delivered the book many years ago, and if it was now, I'd have approached it differently. I've never known capitalism so hideous and so close to fascism, or seen such mass levels of protest and resistance across the world pre-COVID against the racism and police brutality, the media lies, the criminal lunatics dumping on our planet, jailing and torturing those who expose the truth of their crimes. Colontai wrote in this collection of her huge writings from the front line of the first revolution in the world against capitalism. She tells us how people made the revolution and how the revolution made them. And she shows us the deadly forces they were up against. She wrote of workers' incredible solidarity and achievements and victories, creating the new society to inspire the world. And she wrote of the great changes people were experiencing in their personal lives in these social upheavals in Russia, and the revolution in their feelings about sex and marriage and the family and women's place in the new society. She wrote as a Marxist who saw all women oppressed but divided by class, and she found a new language in her writings to draw working women into the struggle of their class for class justice and equality. In her years as a revolutionary, she published 7 books, and as a revolutionary activist, full-time activist and speaker, she somehow managed to publish 7 books and over 200 articles and essays, pamphlets, memoirs. Her pamphlets were especially popular for their punchy, polemical style, known as the famous Colontai style. The 24 pieces published in this book are just a tiny fraction of her voluminous output. From her first years in the political underground to her place in the first Bolshevik government after October 1917. In the opening piece, she describes how her first visit to a factory freed her from her prison of a marriage to join the revolutionary underground and the Social Democratic Party. She read Marx and Lenin, and in the great strikes that swept Russia in those years, she helped smuggle leaflets into the factories. Some of the largest strikes in Russian history were in the tobacco pressing factories in St. Petersburg and the textile towns around Moscow, where over half some factories, over half the workforce, women made up over half the workforce, storming through the factories, smashing machines, attacking scabs and managers. These women were the inspiration for Kollontai's work as a revolutionary, showing her that in striking, women were finding their place in the revolutionary struggle, in the fight for their liberation. During the 1905 revolution, women became strike organizers and public speakers, and she found her place in the revolutionary movement, building the organizational structure to make women a powerful force in the struggle, calling on social democrats to honor their commitment as Marxists to women by setting up party women's committees responsible for all their needs. She was arguing for this virtually alone against a majority of members, including most women, who saw any independent work with women as divisive and a threat to class unity. We didn't know yet how to awaken their class consciousness and arouse their solidarity, she wrote. The defeat of the 1905 revolution drove many Marxists to abandon Marxism for the parties of bourgeois liberalism, which they saw as the only alternative to the autocracy. And the Social Democrats' failure to support women drove many into the liberal feminist organizations, which were campaigning for an all-class alliance of women to fight for the vote and for their improved professional opportunities for women with property. Colontai heckled at their meetings and appealed to factory women not to be recruited into what she called an idyllic alliance with their lady employers and to fight with the party of their class, the Social Democrats, against the capitalist system that oppressed them. In 1908, she fled Russia to escape arrest and lived in exile for the next 8.5 years in Germany, making frequent trips to France, Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden, and England. My years in exile turned me into a convinced internationalist, she wrote, with an unshakable faith in the creative capacity of the working class. She spoke at meetings against war and imperialism and capitalist injustice, and she campaigned with women in the Socialist International to defend its Marxist principles on women, working with them to establish the new socialist holiday of International Women's Day. 3 pieces here, translated from her voluminous writings, then include excerpts from her essay, The New Woman, in which she explored women's struggles through the lives of their counterparts in European and Russian literature. When Russia mobilized for war in 1914, she was one of a small minority of Russian revolutionaries who supported Lenin's call to turn the imperialist slaughter into a capitalist class war. Anti-capitalist class war. She recorded the horror of those early months of the war in her diaries, translated here, and her Bolshevik, and she published her masterpiece of anti-war writing, her Bolshevik pamphlet, Who Needs the War, reportedly read by 7 million Russian and German troops on the front line. Russia's first revolution in 1917, in March 1917, was triggered by the mass Women's Day demonstrations, which led to the abdication of the Tsar and the collapse of the autocracy. She returned to Petrograd a month later to a new Russia and the start of a new life, she wrote, agitating for peace, for the power of the Soviets, and for the complete equality of women. She was the only member of the Petrograd Soviet to speak in support of Lenin's call to overthrow the provisional government and stop the war, and she spoke at massed factory meetings and on board the battleships of the Baltic Fleet, spreading the message, the Bolsheviks' message of peace, revolution, and women's liberation. It was extremely hard to choose from the mass of writings of her writings in the years that followed, and to do justice to her absolutely non-stop activity in the commentaries. Elected Commissar of Social Welfare in the first Bolshevik government in October, and its only woman, she set up children's nurseries, maternity hospitals, home for war veterans and orphans, guided much of the Bolsheviks' early progressive legislation on women's maternity rights and working conditions, and campaigned for women's needs to be at the top of the party's agenda. She was also one of the party's most electrifying public speakers during the civil war that followed the revolution, traveling to the battlefronts, appealing to people to stay and fight the invading armies of the West and their White Guard allies. I think that these years are probably better known to comrades, in which Collontai's activities are in the years after the revolution. And I very much, so much look forward to having a discussion about these in this very, very weird way, I must say, which I'm finding very not being able to see anybody's faces is a very, very odd experience. So then we come to Collontai's crowning achievement, which was the party, the women's department of the party, the Zhenotdel, of which she became director. Women's heroic, it was a recognition partly of the heroic role that women had played in the revolution as fighters and public speakers, like intelligence agents, cavalry commanders. So the Zhenotdel was a recognition of that, and it was, as I said, it was Kollontai's crowning achievement. Established at the end, at the end of 1920, after the invaders had been driven out and the whites defeated. Her campaigning work in the Zhenotdel was quite extraordinary. She campaigned to involve women in their emancipation in the factories, setting up delegates assemblies in the towns and villages to fight for equal pay against sexual exploitation, supervised the publication of 18 journals and magazines, worked with all the different various commissariats on the issues concerning women's health and working conditions, established a commission to get prostitutes off the streets and find them jobs. And Russia and guided the legislation that made Russia the first country in the world to legalize abortion. As I say, the book, it was incredibly hard to choose from all the various things that works and that best explain her ideas and her life and the most relevant to us. And I tried in my commentaries to sort of make some of the connections with our struggles now. And I think the book sort of the book ends as she leaves Russia, and her life effectively as a revolutionary is over. She leaves Russia as punished for her part in the workers' opposition movement, but still a very, very valuable party member, and sent out of Russia as ambassador to Norway. And it was in Norway that she, in her first months there in Oslo, that she looked back on women's lives through fiction. And this is the last piece translated in the book, her story, 3 generations, about the heroine and her mother and her daughter and their different and various and very touching struggles. And I thought maybe that's sort of where the book ends, and that's where maybe we could start our discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cathy. Not easy to fit in such an amazing revolutionary life into such a short space of time. So thank you so much for talking us through, the highlights of Kollontai's revolutionary life. So I'd really encourage people to ask questions and, put any thoughts into the chat box so that we can, have a discussion, about this amazing revolutionary. Some comments already in. Kalsoon says, I feel very inspired learning about Alexandra Kollontai's life. That's great.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, someone's put in the chat box. I feel very inspired learning about Alexandra Kollontai's life.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
So yeah, I mean, I'm sure everyone watching can definitely agree with that. She fought through such adversity. And we've actually got a question for you in the chat, Cathy. Maggie asks, can you say more about what made you write the book now?
Well, as I say, I was commissioned to write it an extremely long time ago. And in 1912, I'm sorry, 2012. And I just had this feeling. I was going around various pickets and I was carrying some of her leaflets around, and I felt that sort of visceral connection. I can only say that, really, that she's there to show us how it's done, and to support us and give us hope, actually. I think she writes, I'd never really thought of seriously translating her works before, but I was so delighted to find what a very simple and direct writer she was. It's not fancy prose or anything, it's just incredibly clear, and I did my best to capture that.
Great. Yeah, I mean, the Kollontai style you were talking about is definitely something that I was, enjoying so much about the book. She is so direct and so clear, and it makes so much sense when she's explaining the importance of class, the importance of women's, position in class. It's hard to find, any questions to have at the end of, reading her piece, because she's gone through so clearly and it explains so well, what the problem is and what the solution is. The problem's capitalism. The solution isn't, bourgeois feminism. The solution is class and revolution. And that's so consistent throughout. That's her answer, for every problem. We've got some more questions, which is great. So Judy asks, Thank you so much for all your work on Kollontai and the revolutionary women of Russia. Can you say more about her political friendships with other socialist women, such as Dora Metfoira and Clara Zetkin?
They're very political friendships. I mean, she had I mean, I think one of the sort of touching things in her life and her writing generally is her love for her childhood friend. And, you know, they obviously were, you know, she was a supportive, politically sympathetic friend, but they weren't comrades in struggle. And I mean, I think she probably saw, I mean, Clara Zetkin was a comrade, you know, an enormously appreciated and valued, you know, comrade in struggle. And Dora Montefiore, I'm sure other people know much more about her than I do, but and she's obviously an extremely interesting woman, but she was Colontai at that particular conference where they met. You know, she identified her as the only Marxist woman in the delegation, and she was, you know, very appreciative of that. You know, Dora Montefiore supported the German, you know, the German motion on Marxist motion on women at the conference. I don't sort of get it. I don't get the impression that was a terribly close friendship. It is. I mean, Colontai was not. You know, when I'm writing about Reisner, for instance, there is absolutely no I in Reisner, no ego at all. Colontai talks about herself a lot, and I'm very glad she does. You know, she sort of shares a lot about herself. But I don't know. I don't really know very much about her friendships. You know, there's a huge reticence in all revolutionaries about their private lives. You know, despite the fact that she wrote a lot about it.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, Cathy, you know, she talks about herself, but I felt, you know, when she is, you know, talking through her situations and her experiences, it's so relatable. You know, obviously, you know, I haven't been in, you know, building a revolution, but, you know, the problems that she's talking about that she faces with capitalism, how women are treated, women's place in society, you can really, you know, relate as well to the type of women she's talking about, you know, working class women who are downtrodden in the system, you know, trying to find their place in the struggle. You know, she writes in such an approachable way that it doesn't feel like she's, you know, trying to teach you or trying to dictate to you what, you know, she's trying to help people. She's trying to help people, you know, find their place in the struggle.
Yes. No, I mean, there was this, I think it's a sort of Western propaganda anti-Soviet thing that revolutionary writing is all very preachy. I mean, it's not been my experience, you know, at all. And actually, there's really very, very strong move against using, you know, against that over-moralizing and over-politicizing. I mean, Trotsky, Bukharin, Lunacharsky, I had some more people. Oh, well, Gorky particularly. I mean, Gorky is one of these people who's always dismissed as a sort of smug moralist. No, he didn't do that. He didn't believe in that. The great writers didn't. Lenin never moralized. You know, he just gave. He was very, very sort of straightforward about the tasks ahead. You know.
Yeah, they wanted people involved, didn't they? They didn't want to, you know, be too unapproachable for people. They were trying to get the working class, you know, involved in the struggle. And if you
I mean, the statues of Lenin still in Russia are the very sort of famous ones where, you know, his trousers are frayed, his buttons are missing, his socks are down. You know, he's the man of the people. That's how that's the image of the revolutionary, you know. All the later Stalinist things of him sort of, you know, heroically posing, you know, with against a sort of golden glow. That's not really how he was portrayed. You know, revolutionaries were just ordinary people.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, talking about Stalin, there's another question in the chat from Martin. He asks, could you explain a little more about Kollontai's trajectory? She clearly rose with the mass movements, and her greatest times were during the 1917 revolution. But unlike many old Bolsheviks, she never broke with Stalin. Could you explain more?
Well, she was very necessary, to the regime, and she performed extremely well as a diplomat. And she was irreplaceable. I don't know if anybody read the biography, I did go into some detail in her diplomatic work in the Great Patriotic War. And so she was sort of downgraded it's very hard for us to know what is the actual truth of her relationship with Stalin. I mean, the article that people quote, 1927 article about the rank and file and the leadership, is that what it's called? It clearly wasn't written by her. I mean, I'm not just being kind of soft on her. I know her language. She didn't write like that. And she actually told her French friend Jacques Sardoul, no, I didn't write that. Or it was a very, very rewritten version of something that she had written. There are plenty of writers and activists who I have studied in their years before the revolution, during the revolution, and in the Stalin period, who didn't join the party, who survived, who did well, who were not Stalin apologists. Colontai wasn't a Stalin apologist, but were what are called conventional, politically conformist.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll ask people to keep putting comments and questions in the chat. Keep it coming. It's good to have this discussion. Obviously virtually, but yeah, keep the contributions and keep the questions coming. Actually, something that I'd quite like to bring up is you mentioned, Cathy, that a lot of her work is obviously focused around the revolution. And the amazing work the Bolsheviks did in the revolution, but obviously, there was a lot of work before the revolution, that Kollontai was doing to build up, women's class consciousness. And, in particular, one of the pieces in the book, I think the social basis of the woman question that she wrote, for working class women before the All Russian Congress of Women in 1908, she talks about men, first and foremost being women's comrades in arms, fighting for a better future, enslaved by the same social relations. And I mean, it'd be good to, hear your thoughts on how relevant that is today, because obviously we've seen, like you said, the Kill the Bill movement is obviously, is taken to the streets, and that obviously started, with the suspected murder of Sarah Everard by a police officer. And the arguments that people were having were, we need to make the streets safer. We need men to, act in a certain way and so on. But as revolutionaries, we understand that actually it's the system that perpetuates these things. And the only way to, win women's liberation is to have, working class men and women fighting side by side, which is something that obviously Kollontai was really trying to push in her writings.
Yes. I mean, it was a question of, and as she said, when women were excluded from the Tsar's commission after the 1905 revolution, she said, women, and they demonstrated against their powerlessness and lack of rights, and men came out in support of them, So it was a question of working with men and women in the revolutionary movement to work in unity. I'm sort of distracted really by this one on the right, about the terrible nature of the Stalin regime. Why did she not break with Stalin, do you think? And I don't want to be ducking that question, Dave. Is it David or Dave? And I would like to hear what you think about it, because I've talked on, and as I said, the book covers, the time until she leaves Russia and her life as revolutionary ends. So the book doesn't actually cover that. It's not that I'm ducking it, but if you would like to talk about it, please do, and why you think that so many people did survive the Stalin terror. And of course, she lost many people she was close to. We know that.
Yeah, so I mean, if anyone wants to, respond to that in the chat, that would be great. We've also got another comment from Colin, and he says, "Congratulations on a wonderful, inspiring book, Cathy. Could you talk more about the relationship between Kollontai and feminism? A Russian bourgeois feminist supported World War I while she opposed it."
I can't see that. Was she what?
While she opposed World War I, Russian bourgeois feminists were fully in support of it.
Well, I mean, thank you very much, Gil. It was just that was just a proof of what she'd been saying about the bourgeois. I mean, the bourgeois feminists, as I say, they grew out of this the spread of these bourgeois parties after the collapse of the 1905 revolution, when they, socialists went into the bourgeois liberal parties and various people, and the Mensheviks cooperated, with the bourgeois liberal parties and with all these huge number of liberal feminist organizations that were springing up, campaigning for the right to the vote and, improved professional opportunities for those with property. So it was all the contrast Colontai makes very clearly, the class differences between the as she calls, the horny-handed women of toil and their employers was an unbridgeable gulf. And the feminists did recruit huge numbers of working women to these organizations. And Colontai, a major part of her political campaigning and several works in this collection about her struggle to double-edged struggle, to get Social Democrats to honour their commitments to women as Marxists and draw them into the strike movement and the revolutionary struggle, and on the other hand, to draw working women away from the Bolshevik, from the liberal feminists, whose goal, of course, was to erode their class unity. That was a very precise nature of their goals, to erode their unity with men. And in that, of course, they were collaborating with the employers who had always used women to bring wages down and divide the working class. That's number one strategy. So it was a massive task. And I say she was arguing virtually alone. Well, of course, she wasn't alone. She mobilized very quickly around her groups of working women who took the struggle forward and continued the struggle when she went into exile. So those are the women who made the who came out on the streets on Women's Day to make the first revolution. But I think, when I translating Collontai's work on laying the framework for a socialist women's movement, in opposition to the feminists. She writes very, as we said before, very simply and very clearly, and makes the choices that women have very obvious. That she was very successful in drawing women into the party of their class, the Social Democrats, and then persuading the Social Democrats to pay proper attention to women and put their needs at the top of their agenda. And that was again like many things. Oh, there's another thing came up. you know, like, sorry, lost my track. Never mind.
No, yeah, I mean, like, you know, the sort of bourgeois feminists taking over the sort of war movement is obviously a parallel that we can see in Britain as well, with the suffragettes sort of
Yeah.
really back in the you know, the war movement, and then you had, you know, the likes of Sylvia Pankhurst sort of, you know, operating more on those class levels. And I think, you know, Kollontai's pamphlet "Who Needs the War," you can really see that sort of, you know, importance of class coming out again. And obviously we know her as a, you know, a great champion of women's rights, but I think in that pamphlet where she's really dissecting the war and dissecting, you know, whose war it really is, there's such a strong focus on class. You know, she, you know, could, you know, she clearly was such a you know, all-rounded revolutionary. It wasn't just, you know, a focus on, you know, making sure that women were liberated. She wanted her class to be liberated. You know, she talks about, you know, working men being, you know, forced to fight for the capitalist profits, which is obviously something that we still see today. But that was obviously, you know, a pattern that was happening across the world with bourgeois feminists back in the war, and yet that solid class focus was so important, you know, especially to overcome the war as well. You know, as we saw, you know, in particular in Russia with the anti-war movement, that you know, really sparked you know, anger for the revolution as well.
Yeah, well, you know, as I was saying, when we have to go past all these people clutching their hearts at the on Armistice Day, you know, we wanted to tell them, well, it actually took 2 revolutions and the collapse of autocracies across Europe to bring it about. That's not really discussed, is it? And
oh, sorry,
I mean, anyway, go on. Yeah, go on.
No, you keep going. No, it's okay.
Well, I suppose, sort of coming back to one of the early questions, you know, why I wrote the thing. It's partly the sort of build-up of this new dangerous Cold War against Russia, and this the most atrocious rewriting of history. I mean, we're used to it, the Cold War lies, and atrocious rewriting of history in parts of Putin's Russia. Some very good historians too, but it was a sort of setting the record straight, really. You know, there's just been such, you know, when the book was meant to be published in 1917 on this, you know, on the centenary. It would have made more sense then, really. But you know, it's not just Bolshevik thuggery and crimes and all that. It's just complete devaluation of, you know, what people stood for, and wanting to do her some justice, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think the book does definitely do her justice. So we've got a question from Twitter. Like I keep saying, keep the questions, keep the contributions coming. But we've now got one from Twitter. So what do you think about her position on personal relationships, as she writes about in Love of Worker Bees?
Well, there is so much there. Obviously, the story at the end is from Love of Worker Bees, and that's about a sort of professional family. One of her most popular, then there's Vasalisa Maligna, which is another one. Oh, do you know what? It's completely slipped my mind what the third one is, but anyway, it's a trilogy. And so they're all, I suppose, all of them have in common that they're all relationships that women, the narrator, the central characters are women, and it's about how is about sort of partly about how relationships they entered into after the revolution are now in crisis, and so challenging old ideas about the old family, rebuilding the new family. At the same time, they are written in during the wars of the years of the new economic policy. So she's writing about women losing many of the gains that they'd made in the revolution, and the new privatized factories where, you know, the bosses had no particular financial interest in funding creches, and women's employment had outstripped the building of creches, you know, huge amount. At the same time, massive losses of male life, particularly in the First World War and the Civil War and the intervention. So that massive outnumbering of women. So Soviet family policy was very contradictory in my view, because, you know, women had to be encouraged to have children to boost this otherwise, you know, risk demographic catastrophe, and at the same time their access to childcare and support was cut. So many of them had to leave their jobs. They were the first to lose their jobs under the NEP. Sort of massive different things happening. So she's talking about all that. Oh, the other story, I'm sorry, I just can't remember the name of it, but it's about a woman's husband who brings a prostitute home. So it's the wife learns through her story. She talks to the prostitute, she learns through her story to identify with her and her suffering and the story, the whole story, you know, losing her job, losing her. So they're very much set in that period in the NEP in the 20s, and so nothing in the women's lives described is stable or secure. Everything is being questioned. It's very a time of great ferment and creativity, and women making new decisions about where they go. And the reason I chose Three Generations, I thought it was a nice ending to the book, because it's sort of all three women of Colontai, really. And, you know, she can be the granny, and she can be the mother, and she can be the daughter. The daughter is a new woman. Colontai had been a new woman in her time, you know. So I think she identifies with all of them. And I think that, you know, that there is a lot of complexity. You know, we talk about her being very simple and direct, but I think there's also a lot of complexity in her, and she accepts that people are complex, and that there is no, you know, formula for sort of human feelings, and she explores those very successfully in fiction, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose that, you know, also brings us on to one of the things she's most, you know, well known for is that idea of free love. And obviously, you know, she was totally against any sort of hijacking of that for, you know, exploiting women or, you know, taking advantage of women. She you know, her idea of free love was, you know, women having choices. And, you know, she talks about in The New Woman, being able to put herself and her work before a man, and, you know, prioritizing her life and what she wanted. And, you know, obviously you see, you know, Kollontai's life in those stories, as you're saying. And, you know, she was fighting for a world where, you know, women could, you know, could have that freedom, but it wasn't just ideas, was it? She wasn't just saying it and then, you know, leaving it. She was, you know, trying to put things in place physically to make that happen, you know, to cut women economically from the kitchen and the house and the family, to actually make those changes happen, rather than them just being nice ideas in an ideal world. She was fighting for that to be implemented.
Yeah, but, you know, nothing, it didn't just all kind of go right. I will just go a little bit digress here, because one of the most shocking things I found in reworking this biography of Reisner is that, you know, the heroine of the Civil War, of infinite strength cavalry commander, sailing on the battleships, that she was beaten, you know, badly beaten and abused by her husband. And I mean, it was such a shocking thing. And, you know, the Bolsheviks made church-sanctioned wife beating. I mean, the church ordered the wife beating away, Bolsheviks outlawed that and made that an offence punishable by jail, and made sex, and were very, very specific about sex crimes. But the law is one thing and behaviour is another, and people lag behind what Lenin called the loathsome remnants of bourgeois marriage. It doesn't just go. People are very complex. Colontai had I'm sure, very, despite talking about people's private lives, we don't really know very much about her private life. We know who she was married to. We know a couple of her lovers, and that's it. And maybe that was it, but we don't know. And I think what I found when I was writing about Colontai, and related to particularly with Reisner too, who's the most brilliant writer. I mean, I wouldn't say Colontai is an absolutely brilliant writer. Reisner is a brilliant writer, extraordinarily powerful and poetic, quite completely unique. She was a writer. She wasn't. These people are pornographized in the West and in Russia. They have to be seen as they're over sexualized. Perhaps I'm just saying that because I'm old. I don't know, but. The fact is, to write as much as she did, as Colontai did, to be a charismatic leader of women, member of the government, frontline speaker, you wouldn't have much, and so on, writing constantly, organizing constantly. Where would the time be for any sort of living constant relationship? That's why I think 3 generations is good. She gets that, and she is almost the young girl in the story, even though she's in her 50s at the time, because people have no time for it.
Yeah, revolutionary struggle is a busy time for people, isn't it?
She talks about the cult of love, but she talks about the future, the communist future, that's all in the future.
Yeah, and obviously then, like you're saying, it's not that everything runs smoothly. It's not that Revolution Day comes and everyone, sort of gets up the next day and, socialism's implemented. It's part of the struggle and part of the fight to have those ongoing battles, even within, the class.
Yes, and making the society as it goes.
Yeah. Keep asking questions, keep putting contributions in the chat. We've still got plenty of time to discuss different things and answer any questions. So yeah, keep putting things in the chat. But something else obviously is how far advanced Kollontai's work was. The Bolsheviks putting through divorce laws, abortion laws, making life easier for women shows. During revolutionary struggle, actually ideas can change and we can have a different way of society. But, these are things that weren't really happening in, a lot of Western places until, 50, 60 years later. And there was sort of Russia, bringing these changes about in, the late 1910s.
Yes. I mean, there could be another chapter to the book. But then, of course, it'd be a different book and it would go out of shape, which would be Afterlife, her afterlife as a revolutionary. So we celebrate her life, and then we see how far how far her ideals were betrayed. And we have to sort of, it's very hard, isn't it, to talk about these incredible achievements against unimaginable odds of the revolution, and how how her ideals were betrayed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think actually, I said we've got plenty of time. We've actually got about 15 more minutes. So get any last minute questions in now. If you have any last minute contributions and questions or things that you would still like to discuss, please put those in the chat. And actually, something that might be good to start thinking about is obviously the world we're in now and the world Kollontai was in. Actually, there's a lot of lessons we can learn. I think she talks about who are the social democrats and what do they want, quite early on in the book that's covered. But, she talks about economic crisis as being inevitable when, having to break from capitalism to stop disasters happening. Well, we've just lived in, one of the biggest pandemics we've ever seen. It's still ongoing. We're in a third wave. And actually, the answers that she says, breaking from the profit-driven system, creating a society run by workers for workers, are the answers to the pandemic and the crisis that we found ourselves in now. It's you can read it and almost think about it today. It doesn't feel like it was written over 100 years ago. It feels like it was almost written for the present day, because obviously we're still under the same system.
Well, I think people are hungry for leadership and for a collective message, and this is a terrible age of individualism and anarchy, and I think her message is of solidarity, and I think because she was 100 years ago, but I still feel she's kind of she's our comrade, and that's the sort of that's the main message of hope that I draw from her. And because we can argue it till the cows come home about what the actual achievements were, and how impossible it was to actually succeed in so much of what they set out to. But kind of going to the sort of root of it, I think, is this incredible mass collective struggle that she was part of. That is sort of, I see, really lacking on the left now, I'm afraid. I mean, in the sort of what, it hasn't kind of cohered yet, I don't think.
Yeah, and then we see what the gains are. I know, yeah, we can sit and argue about them, but there were fundamental gains. One, women's lives did change, working class lives did change. So actually, that collective power, that collective struggle, we know it works. We've seen it not necessarily just in revolutionary periods, but winning gains under capitalism. It's when the class comes together that we have the most gains. And
yes,
that's.
I just think it's what's so lovely about being. I so loved working on this book and being close to her, and it was the people. I mean, her. When I say she tells us how people made the revolution and how the revolution made them, it was actual people. The peasant who came to her door, and the man she met at the office, and Lenin himself, of course.
Yeah, it's a really human side, isn't it? She's talking about the day after the revolution, and they're all sort of sat there.
Yes.
The Central Committee sat there. Lenin's sort of like, taking it all in, and then she's instructed to go off and, reimburse a man whose, horse was stolen by the Tsar.
Yes.
That's the first job she had as,
yes.
as a member of the new government. She had to, pay this peasant for the horse. But it showed how, seriously, as revolutionaries, they took people and took the promises that they made. So. I can't see any more questions or contributions in the chat. So I don't know, Cathy, if you want to say, any sort of final words or, final messages, from the book that we can sort of take forward today. We're in a period of, difficult struggle, the pandemic, fighting against a repressive government. What messages and lessons can we take from Kollontai that, are really going to help us in the fights that are to come? Big question.
Yes, so much. I just think, dip into this book, find something and click into it, and you'll find you'll find something. I think just to go back, one of my favourite pieces is who are the Social Democrats and what they want. It's a sort of laying out really what, I mean, obviously it's after Lenin wrote What's to Be Done and defined the role of the party. So the party is already a sort of defined entity, you know, very sort of respectable record, you know, in the strike movement. And I really like that pamphlet that she wrote, Who are the Social Democrats and What They Want. She writes incredibly, who are the Social Democrats? They are you, the workers. She addresses it and published in the Workers' Annual. It's addressed very, very directly to workers and spells out so very clearly and beautifully, I think, some of the sort of key ideas of Marx, and where Marx's ideas on you know, class revolution, you know, a revolution, class revolution against capitalism, where these ideas sprang from, and the socialists who went before Marx, and then Marx, and how we put Marx's idea into practice, and how, it's very, very, you know, it was written for the workers, and it's how I sort of feel about her writing in general, really, and it was my approach to the book. You know, it came out of the movement, for the movement, and I hope will be, you know, read by the movement for against this rotten, terrible system. I did feel encouraged by the demonstrations last week, and there will be more this weekend, obviously.
Yeah, let's hope. Yeah, that people will be back out on the street. Just some final comments that we're getting in from people. So Rob says, this was absolutely fascinating. Can't wait to read the book. Many thanks, Cathy, for the book, and Bookmarks for putting on the launch. Annette said, I'm interested in knowing what happened to her life post-revolution, and welcome another chapter of her life in another book. There are so many other struggles around the world, and we hope for a new beginning. Maggie says, Kollontai's writing speaks to us today. Thank you, Cathy, for your writings. Annette also says, thank you for sharing us sharing with us this evening. And Judy says, many thanks for all your wonderful books, Cathy. I love the biography of Larissa Reisner and Fathers and Daughters too. And thanks to Isabel too. Oh, you're welcome. I bought the book and can't wait to read it. So thank you to everyone for listening and contributing and getting involved in the discussion. Massive thanks to Cathy for, you know, not only, you know, talking us through Kollontai today, but, you know, going through her writings and, you know, translating them for the first time for us to be able to, you know, have that accessibility. Kollontai is talking to us, but I suppose if you can't speak Russian, then, you know, there is that language barrier. So thank you so much, Cathy, for, you know, making Kollontai, you know, so, available to us. So as I said, you can buy Alexandra Kollontai, Writings from the Struggle, at Bookmarks. I absolutely recommend buying it. As Cathy was saying, it's almost like a handbook to the sort of struggles that we're facing as revolutionaries today. So absolutely recommend buying it. You can also buy Emma's book, The Rebel's Guide to Alexandra Kollontai, and obviously many other books in Bookmarks that are, again, going to arm us for the fight ahead. So just a final thanks to everyone. Big thanks to Cathy. And yeah, solidarity, everybody. And yeah, look forward to the fights to come.